welcome to the Far Left Show. Today we are going to talk about the Safe Third Country Agreement, which is a extremely pressing issue that we have not really seen talked about a whole lot in the progressive or like corporate media spheres. So today I have Ilan Avineri. He is a PhD student who is going to talk with us about the agreement. Ilan, are you there?
Yeah.
All right. So do you think you could tell us a bit about the Safe Third Country Agreement, kind of like what it is?
Yeah.
I think
yeah. So the agreement was under negotiation between Guatemala and the United States for the past month or so, between diplomats on both sides and the administration in Guatemala. But the details of the agreement were kind of under the radar for an extended amount of time. But in essence, if I can summarize it, the deal requires Central American migrants to first apply for asylum protection in Guatemala before heading to the United States. And those who fail to do so and arrive at the US border without first applying in Guatemala will have to be sent back to Guatemala by the Department of Homeland Security. But that's kind of a legalistic language. And in essence, the deal makes it almost impossible for anyone coming from Central America to the United States to make a credible claim for asylum, because the Trump administration will argue that they could easily apply in Guatemala. But of course, the idea that the Morales government in Guatemala, which has consistently proven that it is deeply corrupt, cares or has the capacity to help migrants is kind of crazy, because the government for decades and decades has failed to provide jobs for the campesinos that are leaving the country. So it's kind of ridiculous to think it would be able to humanely house all asylum seekers. And Guatemalans have a deep awareness of this incompetence of the government. You know, it's been long established, and even putting aside the series of damning corruption scandals endured by President Morales, in 2017, for example, nearly 40 teenage girls died in a fire at a state-run children's home in Guatemala City, and the children's home was state-run, and for many months, there were court judges that were consistently ruling that the government's public housing, specifically this state-run children's home, was in dangerous condition. But President Morales' Secretary of Social Welfare basically ignored these orders, and because of that, these young girls passed. So Guatemalans are not only aware that it will be more difficult to seek asylum in the U.S., but they also know that Central Americans who seek asylum in Guatemala will likely be housed in even worse conditions than American detention centers if they are housed at all.
I mean, there's people that already can't eat. They already don't have, healthcare or any sort of services. How do they expect to help out these refugees?
Yeah, that's a good question. And I mean, the housing example that I just gave is emblematic of a larger problem, which is, you have Guatemala is one of the poorest countries in Latin America, but it's also it has one of the highest rates of childhood malnutrition. Some estimates are above 50% for children under the age of 5. So the idea that this government which has proven itself to be deeply corrupt, and a lot of political figures take money directly from cartels, and so the idea that they're capable of administering housing, much less healthcare and jobs and education, like you just laid out there, it's impossible to conceive of a situation where the government would be able to provide those services.
And you were recently in Guatemala, and
yes.
Where did you go?
So I spent some time in Zacatecas, which is a department very close to Guatemala City. But I also spent a couple weeks in Huehuetenango, which is a department in the Western Highlands of the country, and it's a border department. So in this department, you really see the shifting landscape along the border, and you can really hear stories from people about what's beginning to change in terms of policy, not just of the Morales government, but the effects of the United States on migrants and along the border.
And you said you can see the effects. What do you mean by that necessarily?
Yeah, so I guess I could just give a summary of what I heard, the small details I heard, or awareness of the Third Country Agreement among people in Huehuetenango. Yeah. So when I was in the country last month, President Morales and Trump were still negotiating the third country agreement, but nothing was signed yet. So at that time, most people I spoke with were completely unaware of the details of the specific agreement, as are most people in the United States. But what did become clear to me when I spoke with Guatemalans in the highland departments of Huehuetenango is that the signing of the deal is mostly just seen as another effort by the US and the outgoing Morales government to keep Central Americans from leaving their countries. And of course, opinions of the situation in Guatemala are mixed, but many people I talked to in the city of Huehuetenango, for example, which is the capital of the department, told me that the US military has been more active in the region during recent months to prevent people from leaving the country. Many Huehuetecos, which is how people in the region call themselves, told me that they saw American troops close to the Zona Militar using high-tech equipment to dig essentially a well for American soldiers, presumably for a long-term stay along the Guatemalan border. And when I was in a small village too, north of Chiantla, which is in kind of the center of the Huehuetenango department, I personally saw a group of about 6 American soldiers being escorted around by a single Guatemalan soldier. So while the Safe Third Country Agreement is an escalation in American immigration policy, and we can see that, if you examine the long history of immigration policy in the United States towards Central America, it's mostly seen by ordinary people in Guatemala as just another attempt by both President Morales and the US military to prevent people from leaving their countries. But I would also add that isn't to say that people aren't outraged by the deal in Guatemala. When the agreement was signed a couple days ago and the news broke, there were dozens of people protesting in front of the National Palace in Guatemala City, demanding the resignation of the president for cracking down on migration and failing to address the root causes. So there definitely is a backlash.
And this agreement was also struck down by the courts in Guatemala as well.
Yes, exactly. And this is the consistent trend, not just in Guatemala, but in Central America and Latin America at large for the past 100 years or so, which is there has been a repeated violation of the sovereignty of Guatemala, for example, by the United States, which has made institutions seem illegitimate to many people. So if I can give an example of this, in 1954, it's more well known now, but the CIA overthrew a democratically elected president of Guatemala named Jacobo Arbenz. And it's a complicated situation, but the general historical consensus is that the United States overthrew Jacobo Arbenz for both ideological reasons. They presumed him to be a communist, but also because he was simply redistributing land owned by American-owned monopolies, including the United Fruit Company, to landless campesinos in places like the rural highlands where people are fleeing right now. So it's essentially this third country agreement is yet another example of a violation of the social contract in Guatemala, where the United States pressures President Morales under threat of sanctions, under threat of tariffs, under threat of travel bans to accept a deal. And when the courts in Guatemala, the nascent and challenged legal structure, attempts to strike down or at least file a temporary injunction on the deal, President Morales feels forced to overrule the court. But in the process, it's not just the passage of the third country agreement that harms the country. It also leaves lasting damage as more and more people have less and less confidence in the courts, the judicial system, and the general structures of the government as a whole.
Right. I think a lot of times people who are just they say, why don't people just stay there and make the place better, right? And it sounds as if the U.S. just exerts this intense and extreme oppression and opposition towards people in Guatemala being even able to create these institutions that are respected and dignified. Would you agree with that?
Yeah. So Yeah, I would say that your summary there is the consistent trend under both Republican administrations and Democratic administrations for decades and decades and decades now. Um, but I would say that there has been a consistent escalation in not just our immigration policy, but our interventions in the region. What we saw under George Bush, for example, in the early 2000s was a crackdown along the American-Mexican border on immigrants from Central America at the time. But this kind of overt defense of U.S. borders was very public and inspired a backlash to this kind of new militarization of the border, the expansion of the Department of Homeland Security. And Obama in 2008 really recognized that while people, as they have for decades and decades, were looking to the United States for a better life, that the overt militarization along the border did not inspire confidence and security in American power and leadership in the world. So under his administration, what we saw was the continual pushing of the border further south, the outsourcing of American border security to the Mexican government, the increased militarization on the Mexican side of the Mexico-Guatemala border. And now we're reaching a kind of final conclusion where Trump is trying to throw all his political weight on Morales, who is a deeply unpopular political figure, to force him to sign an agreement that basically moves the border even further south and makes all asylum claims in the United States from Central America almost impossible. And by forcing Central Americans to apply for asylum in Guatemala, it's essentially saying that Central Americans have no legal recourse in the United States to seek asylum.
Right. It seems like I mean, there's thousands of people leaving Guatemala trying to escape from gangs, from violence, and also climate change seems to be making the region uninhabitable. Could you give us a little more of an explanation about like how is climate change affecting Guatemala?
Right. Yeah. So I'm really glad you mentioned this because this is a thread of the immigration discussion that is really left untouched. You know, we hear from both Trump but also from Democrats that that immigration from Central America is caused by gangs and violence, and it's perpetuating this old myth that Latin American people are hot-blooded. They can't govern themselves. They're slaves of their own passions, and they can't seem to manage functional states for themselves, and that's why gangs develop. And of course, this narrative is super ahistorical. It completely ignores the historic role of the United States in perpetuating, financing, and inspiring violence in the region. But as you mentioned, climate change is as much of a driver, if not more, in many cases. And in the Guatemalan case, it is, in my opinion, the main driver. So just like many countries along the equator, climate change in Guatemala is having a devastating effect, but particularly on farmers in the western highlands of Huehuetenango, places that my dad grew up in. And a majority of people who live in these areas are indigenous people, and their ability to live is deeply dependent on how much corn or potatoes they're able to grow. And in recent years, severe drought and heavy rains have become more common and made it more and more difficult for these campesinos to predict weather patterns. In Climentoro, for example, corn is usually planted in early April, just before a period of extended rainfall. But during both May and June of last year, for example, the area was uncharacteristically dry and many crops died. So when I asked my cousin Yarcinio, who's a climate activist in the region, about this, he told me that farmers have no other option really but to migrate to the United States when their crops fail. And while many people resort to cutting down trees to sell for quick money, which obviously only furthers the deforestation in the region, others look for work in the cities. Guatemala City is a main recipient of climate refugees, but neither are sustainable options for most people in the long run. The cities aren't offering labor, and it's broadly assumed that the cities are just temporary way stations on the way to the north to the United States.
Really?
So because of this climate devastation, thousands of people are leaving the country, and the Safe Third Country Agreement is just another attempt by the Trump administration to ignore the root causes of the problem and to blame Guatemalans for a deteriorating climate of which they have very little control.
So these cities feel like temporary cities that were once more permanent. They now feel temporary. Is that what you're saying?
I guess I wasn't particularly clear about that. No, okay, so there are cities in the Western Highlands, small villages, where people are migrating from, leaving because their crops are failing. And these cities have become ghost towns of sorts where you can see, and I saw it for myself, the remnants of old houses, but very, very few people to match the amount of houses in these areas. And it's because it's just impossible to live there. It's impossible to sustain those homes. And the infrastructure in Guatemala is very, very weak. So even if you wanted to hold on to your childhood home or house that or region that your family has lived in for an extended amount of time, there's no way for you to transport goods to large markets. So these towns have become ghost towns. What I was mentioning before, though, was that cities like Guatemala City, people that are migrating from rural areas are looking to these cities for opportunity. They want to stay in their own country, but because there's so little opportunity in these massive metropolitan centers like Guatemala City, those cities for those migrants have become more of temporary way stations on the way to the United States because they're just waiting around until they either find work, which is unlikely, or until they can gather the means to head north or gather their families.
Got it. And when you mentioned the U.S. Soldiers at the border, they basically just stop these migrants that are heading north. And how do you send them back? You just tell them to turn around, basically?
Right. So I did not witness myself the soldiers interacting with people on the border. I didn't go all the way to the border. But I would just say that the soldiers are there to assist in operations to curtail migration to the north, beefing up the military between the Mexico-Guatemala border and supporting the Guatemalan military has long been a policy of the United States, dating back to the Cold War and earlier then. So that's more of the process that's going on.
I see. And also, so with all this migration or people are trying to leave, what does this third safe country agreement, what are the implications that it has on the people of Guatemala? Like what's going to happen, basically?
Right. So this is kind of more of a bureaucratic question because the deal has been signed, but it hasn't been implemented yet, and there's a chance it won't be implemented. There's talk that Guatemalans will be exempted from the deal because they're willing to provide asylum, at least in name, to Hondurans and Salvadorans that are also heading north, albeit in slightly lesser numbers. But exempted, yeah. So they would be able to apply for asylum in the United States, but it's unclear whether Trump intends to keep Guatemala exempt, and it's very unclear that President Morales has the authority or ability to contest American demands as it pertains to the deal. So the future remains uncertain. What is clear, though, is that asylum claims in the U.S. are already more difficult to make than they were, in the 1980s, for example, when the Civil War was raging in Guatemala, but also in El Salvador, and that when these claims are harder to make, people really have no option to get over. They have no option to go north, and also it's not as though they can settle safely in Mexico. For decades and decades, Central Americans have been subject to extreme brutality at the hands of the Mexican authorities as well. So they're really, in a sense, locked up. Those who want to leave countries like Guatemala or Honduras are locked on the isthmus more or less now as a result of this policy.
Got it. And this sounds almost well, it is a disaster. It's a climate disaster.
Hmm.
It's almost like I want to say the word genocide. Would you say it in a way it is a genocide? I don't know what exactly it
Yeah,
is. It
I mean,
definitely feels like that.
I see what the conversation around genocide can easily get really academic, and there's a group of people who believe that quibbling over how intentional killings are um, is a way to chart out a loose definition of genocide or a strict definition of genocide.
Yeah.
So I don't feel like I can take a stand in that debate. I have sympathy as a as a child of one parent who was a refugee from the civil war in Guatemala, but also another parent whose parents escaped the Holocaust in the 1940s, sympathetic to, all kinds of descriptions of violence. And I don't really want to get down in the weeds in that debate. What I will say is, as migration continues from Central America and becomes more and more dire and necessary as climate change continues to ravage these places, because it's not like the increased heat, the unpredictability of the weather patterns is going to go away. In fact, it's only going to get more severe. And if the most conservative climate estimates come to be by the end of the century, we're looking at millions of refugees from Central America north. So I would say, I wouldn't agree with the terminology of a genocide, but I would say that we are seeing a slow moving, gradual, over decades concentration of people further and further south of the American border. And if there comes a time where there's too many to stop, of course, this is assuming, almost playing into the language, that they're dangerous, they're violent, of which they're not. They're my family, they're my close friends. Um, But if we assume that this large group of people is a danger to the United States, I can't say that there couldn't be something genocide-like or extremely overt violence in the future as refugees continue, which is why it's incredibly important that the left in the United States moves to push for more radical immigration policy that continues to assert the humanity of large groups of people, and to listen to the stories of the people themselves, the activists from Guatemala who have been pushing not just their own government, but providing assistance to migrants, supporting each other's families in migration, and telling their own stories of brutality, not just at the hands of the military in the past, but of a dire economic situation, specifically in the Western Highlands in the present.
That goes to my views about the media here. There's corporate media, but not even corporate media. It seems like a lot of progressive media just isn't covering this Safe Third Country Agreement and the
Right.
human costs that would come from that. Why is that?
Yeah, that's a good question. If I can get into the history of a bit. For decades now, the general media in the U.S. has increasingly demonized immigrants, not just from Guatemala, but Central America as a whole. And we're all aware of Trump's famous line when he launched his campaign, but it really has been a consistent trope of the American media for decades to describe migrants from Latin America as a tidal wave, a swarm, as rapists and murderers. But and of course that kind of language has been more prevalent on the right, but the narrative never accounts for the historical roots which have also contributed to migration from Guatemala in the past. For example, the use of drug networks in the 1970s, for example, to ship weapons to brutal military governments on the part of the United States, the tacit support for what I will call a genocide committed by President Rios Montt in the early 1980s, and the flooding of Guatemalan markets with cheap corn in the 1990s, these kinds of free trade policies championed by Bill Clinton and George W. Bush and President Obama, which forced many farmers into the cities because they could no longer compete with American corn. This ignorance of history has consistently been used by right-wing media in the United States to justify increasingly vicious crackdowns on immigration from Central America, and to justify policies like the Third Safe Country Agreement that's being ignored by the media now. But I think it's also important, like you said, to acknowledge the failure of supposedly left-leaning media and politicians in the United States who have often wrapped the same xenophobic policies in a kind of thin veneer of humanitarianism. And we often forget left-wing media as well, even, not just mainstream supposedly left-leaning media, but actual left, for example, often forget, or at least don't acknowledge to the degree that I think is necessary, that there were more deportations under Barack Obama than there were under George W. Bush, and that it was the Obama administration that did everything it could to legitimize an anti-democratic coup in Honduras in 2009. So while President Obama and the media that supports him have spoken more highly of Central America, their policies and the policies parroted by the media have often contributed to the same deteriorating humanitarian situations in these countries. And I'm pretty certain that the reason why traditional media doesn't talk about it is because of a couple factors. The first being they have a profit motive. So their goal is to cover sensational stories that get coverage, that people will tune in to follow their favorite characters. It's very alarming how American media has become a complete show, like a drama, as though the real situations and struggles of different groups of people are kind of a sideshow to these different characters, not just in the Trump administration, but on the Democratic side as well. Yeah. But I would also say that we also have a problem of human psychology on another level, which is people only have a specific capacity to hear things that are, to them, horrific and new. And I think that's something that we really need to work on expanding our capacity to take in information that's disconcerting, that's difficult, that's something that we don't face in our own lives, and to engage with it in a way that's sustainable and builds sympathy, and not just sympathy, but action to help the people that are struggling with the issues themselves, much less just having to hear about it.
A lot of privileged people in the United States, they're afraid to talk about politics. I always forget about that. Like sometimes I'll just start talking about it because I feel like what's more important to talk about than this stuff, And
right.
People love to throw in comments like, let's not talk about politics right now. And I forget that. It seems like at this point that people shouldn't feel that anymore. It should become a constant dialogue.
Right.
Yeah.
And I think that it's very tempting to throw all the blame at media institutions for failing to educate people on sensitive issues, and it's obviously been a decades-long process by American media to escape the role of the United States in these countries. Exactly. Our involvement, our illiberal actions in the past while espousing democracy, all these things are things that are new and the media has had a role in furthering. But I also think that with the advent of Twitter and social media and institutions like Jacobin, which I just criticized slightly, Jacobin, The Intercept, The Nation, new narratives to Americans at least are coming to the fore. People are learning that the country that they love, that they truly believed represented democracy in the world, has done horrible things. I spent much of my time studying the coup in 1954 in Guatemala, but also the Guatemalan Civil War. And when you tell ordinary people, the United States, evangelical organizations in the United States, were working incredibly hard to ship weapons using illegal drug routes, to ship illegal weapons to a Guatemalan dictatorship that was committing a genocide against 90% civilians. I think for the sanity of activists, we have to remember the conditions that they grew up in, and that any amount of large information towards any person is a bit disorienting.
No, I agree with you. I think
Yeah.
it's. Would you say that it's a good thing to simplify these topics, not to like confiscate, like confuse people, but to sort of just present things in very simplified terms in a way?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. I think it really depends because I think it's important to state things very clearly. Like, there's a historical debate over whether the coup in 1954 in Guatemala was done because we wanted to maximize power or because the American government wanted to support, American corporations. The Secretary of State who oversaw the coup had a vested interest in the United Fruit Company lands in Guatemala. And there's an academic debate over whether it was power or power maximization, or whether it was, economic interest that led to our involvement. And that's a debate to be had, and I don't think it needs to be glossed over. But I do think that when you talk to people, both of those situations, whether it's power maximization or economic interest, are self-interested, and they disregard the needs of thousands of people in these countries, for the benefit of us, whether it's the United States and the people of the United States, or a wealthy few at the top of the American hierarchy. So I don't think that those details, when you're communicating with a large audience, are necessary to inspire political action. But one last thing I'd like to add on the subject is where I think complexity is needed is during all this talk of humanitarian crisis on the border and the third country agreement. Many often portray Guatemala, Honduras, and El Salvador as suffering countries full of suffering. And while they definitely hope to inspire sympathy for the people of these countries, and it's born of what at least is a compassion on the part of many, they often ignore activism and resilience of Central America. When I was in Guatemala, for example, many people told me that they would keep working for their families in Guatemala despite the dire situation in many parts of the country. Others told me that they would keep voting amidst rampant corruption and political candidates that seem less than promising, and that they would keep fighting for a better life for their children in the country. So there are people fighting there for their country constantly, and to cast them as kind of helpless, I don't think is useful. Another example is there were migrants who planned to leave who told me that they're choosing to become a hope, to embody a hope for their children and to chart a better life. So as horrific as the stories are, you're seeing people that are deeply committed to building and finding a better life for their children. So while the American left, I think, needs to push for the decriminalization of the U.S. border in the midst of this escalating climate catastrophe, we should be careful, and we should engage with complexity so we don't fall back into a violent history, which is so often assumed that Central America desperately needs saving.
Right. Well, I think that was an amazing and beautiful explanation of just the safe third country agreement. Would you have any other details, anything else you'd want to share about just this whole thing that's going on?
No, I'd just like to thank you for your time, and also for viewers or listeners that can read in Spanish. Nomada is a Guatemalan publication that's been writing extensively on both migration and the climate crisis from a left-leaning perspective, funded by Guatemalan journalists, and it's an excellent publication. And aside from that, I'd just like to thank you for having me on.
Thank you so much, Ilan. You are awesome. Keep doing what you do. Thank you. I'd love to have you on again whenever you want to talk about these things.
Yeah, anytime. Sounds good.
All right. Take care.